And that's the challenge of a neutral, is you need to be aware of the techniques and the process and the influence and yet remain neutral. So again, you're trying to have an influence to a resolution. You as a neutral don't care what the ultimate numbers are or things like that, but you're going to have influence on people whether you like it or not. You remain neutral and then be thoughtful about how you're impacting on that. And understand too, remember what we said at the outset, they have an impact on you too. Right? Nobody's a blank slate. What you need to do is be aware of what's going on and what's going to impact you so that you can guard against it. We're all able to be influenced. So if we're more aware of, okay, well, this could be a foot in the door technique that an attorney is using, and they're trying to get me to buy in with them. You can guard against that and say, I got to be on guard that I remain neutral in this situation.
Tells us that people respond more to identified people or to specific unidentified people, or even to a specific unidentified people, than to statistics, right? So if we want to make our message more powerful in our work, if we want to be more persuasive, it behooves us to be concrete, right? Use analogies that are that utilize specific people and have them include specific
Jack, I think, again, if you want to have an impact, you're better off to cite to a specific example that you were a part of than to say, I'm aware of statistics that show blah, blah, blah. That's going to get through to them more if you can say, look, I've been involved in a case where the court did this. So your assertion that the court always does X, Y, and Z is not consistent with my experience because I've been involved in a specific case where this happened.
Right? We're trying to make a list of points. How we order the points will impact how often they're remembered, or their impact or persuasiveness on the intended audience. This particular phenomenon known as serial position effect. So the same thing applies in terms of arguments. If I've got 5 points I want to make that I want you to hear, right? Well, I might want to try to put my best stuff first and last, and maybe the weaker stuff in the middle. Because I know your tendency is, if I give you a list of stuff, you'll be less likely to pay attention to or remember the stuff that happens in the middle, just by virtue of me giving you a list of things.
And I think for the neutrals in the room, this helps you kind of plan what you might be doing. If you say, look, we got several days of mediation ahead of us, depending on what you're doing perhaps, you should know that if you have something really, really important, you think this, of all things that we're going to be working through, this is important, I wouldn't put it in the middle. I'd plan it at the beginning of a day or the end of the day, right? Because it may get lost. And even if it doesn't get lost, what they're going to perhaps perseverate on when they leave, as disputants can sometimes do, are the things they heard first and the things they heard last. So we want you to be aware of that.
Ironically, did we put this in the middle of our presentation? Okay, so how many arguments, if you're trying to plan, how many arguments do I make? Well, it actually depends. The research says it depends. If your audience is highly engaged, like this one, right, actively listening, right, then you go for quality over quantity. So more is not necessarily better when your audience is actively engaged, they're actually listening to you. But if you are getting the notion that the audience is not quite engaged, bored, distracted, whatever, definitely not this group. But then you go with quantity over quality. More tends to be better. And the idea here, kind of with what the research kind of says from a commonsensical perspective, is that if they're not really listening, they'll just assume that because you gave more stuff, you're more right. There are 2 classic influence techniques that are identified in psychological research. And in particular, this is big on social psychology. The door in the face technique and the foot in the door technique. These are the actual names for them. The door in the face technique involves asking someone to comply with a ridiculous request that's sure to be rejected, and then immediately following that or pairing it with a much more reasonable request, one that you can live with, one that you actually want them to agree with. The reason by doing so, pairing the unreasonable request with the more reasonable one, actually enhances the likelihood of them complying with the reasonable request, as compared to if you didn't ask them for the ridiculous request to begin with, right? That they'll comply. The principle at work here is one of reciprocity, right? someone that makes a concession and says, the person asking for the charity, okay, all right, $50 is too much, but how about $1, right? They're making a concession. Our natural instinct is to be reciprocal there and say, well, they made a concession, so why I will too, right? Okay, here's $1 for a candy bar.
And you're probably familiar with this principle, right? Don't you try to get parties to make concessions? We're trying to get them to agree. All right, you can call me by the first name. I call you by the first name. Congratulations, we each made a concession. You don't want to. Where people get frustrated is you come in with an honest estimate or an honest number, and they say no. Now you have nowhere to go. We know from the social psychology literature that if you come up high, you make a concession, you increase your chances of getting acquiescence than if you started at that reasonable number. Which is not, it's kind of a bummer, right? Wouldn't we all just like to be honest and say, like, I'll give you an honest number, you give me an honest number, let's see if we can work this out. Unfortunately, that's not how the brain works. So,
conversely, if we can get someone saying yes to one thing, it enhances the likelihood of them saying yes to something else. By virtue of just by the fact that we've got them to agree or acquiesce to something. This is illustrative of the foot in the door technique. It's where you get someone to say yes to one thing as increasing the likelihood of them saying yes to something else. Right? The principle at work here is that we have this inherent tendency to remain consistent. Right? So if we've said yes to all these things, all of a sudden then, if we're presenting with a situation in which we're inclined to say no, we may have some resistance to that because we know we've said yes to a lot of things right before that, right? We don't want to seem inconsistent. We don't want to seem wishy-washy.
Which is exactly why you're trying to get them to agree on simple things at the outset. Yeah. Can we agree that we're going to sit here? Can we agree that we're going to use these titles, these names? Because you're using this to some extent. You're saying, yeah, all right, we're all agreement. And you're reinforcing it. Congratulations, I'm glad we were able to reach that agreement. And you're using this, you're getting your foot in the door. That, hey, this is a process by which we're going to come to agreements. And they don't want to later on say, well, I've been agreeing and we're all working together, and now I'm the one who's kind of causing problems. So you're using these techniques.
Yeah. We have a natural tendency to conform. Humans want to conform. And what Ash did was he had basically 5 people get in a room. And he put up some pictures like this. Basically 4 lines. One line was the target line, and the other lines, A, B, and C, were labeled. And he said to the 5 people, all right, I'm conducting an experiment here on agreement and perception. I'd like for everybody to go around and tell me which of the 3 lines, A, B, or C, is most similar in length to the target line. Now, it was designed kind of like this to be fairly obvious, right? Now, here was the catch. 4 out of the 5 people sitting in on the experiment were actors. They were paid by Ash. And he told them to intentionally respond with an incorrect response. And he had them all respond with B, right? And the one person, actually what the experiment was all about, was to judge the one person not in on it to see how readily they would conform, which is basically how readily they would give an absolutely, obviously incorrect response simply because the other members of the panel wanted them to do it. Yep. And that the research showed that 75% of the participants actually ended up conforming at least one time, right? And 50%, half of the people ended up conforming on 6 or more problems.
Dynamics. So you need to, as you're kind of being thoughtful about who's going to be in the room and how am I going to move people around and who's going to see who and who's going to be involved in the process, you want to be aware of what goes on in group processing and group dynamics.
Sure, because we know that there are different factors involved in group dynamics that will affect how much people conform, how readily they will conform. You know, the bigger the group, the more likely there is to be conformity, right? So the more people you have wanting you to do something commonsensical, more likely you are to do it, right? How unanimous the group is actually will influence how likely you are to conform, right? So like Ash would have, all the 5 people, have the one person not in on it, and he'd have an actor break ranks and just say the other line, the 3rd line, which was clearly not the right answer either. But what he found was when he did that, it actually enhanced the likelihood of the one person to not conform, just by having somebody break ranks. So how unanimous a group is will affect how likely they are to conform. And then you've got all these other kind of group dynamics and personal characteristics that come into play. You know, how attracted the person is to the group, and this, I think, this goes to who's in the room and how that might have influence. You know, the more the person expects to interact with the group will affect how likely they are to conform. The lower the status the person holds in the group and the less accepted they feel will enhance their likelihood of conforming.